The thundering hooves of horses echoed through the dusty streets of Willow Creek as Ruby Blackburn clutched her battered valise, watching the stage-coach that had delivered her disappear into the distance. The year was 1878, and the Montana Territory stretched before her like a vast unknown, as broken and wild as her own heart. Ruby brushed away a strand of auburn hair that had escaped her simple bonnet. Her eyes, once bright with dreams, now clouded with the shadows of her past. The small frontier town was to be her new beginning, though she hardly believed in such things anymore. "Madam? You look like you could use some direction." The deep voice startled her, and Ruby turned to find herself looking up at a tall figure silhouetted against the late afternoon sun. He stepped forward, and she could see him clearly now, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by sun and wind, yet kind eyes that crinkled at the corners. His clothes were trail-worn but clean, and the worn leather holster at his hip spoke of a man who knew how to survive in these untamed lands. "I'm Kieran James," he said, removing his hat in a gesture of respect that seemed from another time. "Town marshal of this little spot of civilization, such as it is." Ruby nodded stiffly, her guard immediately rising. "Ruby Blackburn. I've come to stay with my aunt, Esther Miller. She runs the dressmaker's shop, or so I'm told." The marshal smiled, replacing his hat. "Miss Esther's shop is just down the street. Been expecting you, has she?" "Yes," Ruby lied, knowing full well her arrival would be as surprising to her aunt as her departure had been to those she'd left behind in Boston. Kieran studied her for a moment, as if sensing the falsehood, then gestured toward the boardwalk. "Allow me to escort you. These streets can be confusing to newcomers." Ruby hesitated, then reluctantly accepted his offer. As they walked, the marshal's presence seemed to part the evening crowd. Men nodded respectfully, women offered small smiles, and even the rough-looking cowboys lounging outside the saloon straightened slightly as they passed. "Your aunt is well respected here," Marshal James said as they walked. "Came out west after losing her husband in the war. Built that business from nothing." Ruby's grip tightened on her valise. "I suppose we have that in common then." "Building something from nothing?" he asked. "No," Ruby replied, her voice barely audible above the street noise. "Being left with nothing to build from." Something in her tone made the marshal glance down at her, but he asked no questions, for which Ruby was grateful. They walked the rest of the way in silence until they reached a neat storefront with Miller's Fine Dressmaking painted in elegant gold letters across the glass. Kieran stepped up to the door and knocked firmly. Moments later, a thin woman with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun appeared. Her eyes, the same shade of green as Ruby's, widened in shock. "Ruby, child, is that you?" Ruby stepped forward, suddenly feeling like the little girl who had once visited this very aunt during happier times. "Hello, Aunt Esther. I had nowhere else to go." The older woman's expression softened immediately, and she pulled Ruby into an embrace that smelled of lavender and cotton. Over her aunt's shoulder, Ruby caught the marshal watching them, an unreadable expression on his face. "Thank you, Marshal," Esther said, finally releasing Ruby, "for seeing my niece safely to my door." Kieran James tipped his hat. "My pleasure, Miss Esther." His eyes met Ruby's once more. "Welcome to Willow Creek, Miss Blackburn. I hope you find what you're looking for here." With that, he turned and walked away, his tall figure soon blending with the evening shadows. Ruby watched him go, feeling a strange mixture of relief and disappointment. Then her aunt was ushering her inside, away from curious eyes and the vast Montana sky that seemed to see too much. The following weeks passed in a blur of activity as Ruby settled into life at her aunt's shop. Esther had welcomed her without pressing for explanations, providing a small room above the shop and teaching her the dressmaking trade. The work was demanding but satisfying, and Ruby found herself grateful for the distraction it provided from her memories. It was on a Thursday afternoon when the bell above the shop door jingled, and Ruby looked up from the bodice she was carefully stitching to see Marshal James step inside, removing his hat as the door closed behind him. "Marshal," she acknowledged, setting aside her work. "My aunt is out delivering a dress to Mrs. Thornton. Can I help you with something?" Kieran shifted slightly, suddenly looking less like the confident lawman who had escorted her through town. "Actually, Miss Blackburn, I came to see you." Ruby felt her pulse quicken inexplicably. "Oh, there's to be a social at the church on Saturday evening. Nothing fancy, just some music, dancing, good food. I thought, that is, I wondered if you might allow me to escort you." The invitation caught Ruby entirely off guard. In the weeks since her arrival, she had exchanged only brief greetings with the marshal when their paths crossed in town. He had been unfailingly polite but had kept his distance, as if sensing her need for space. "I don't dance anymore, Marshal," she said finally, her fingers unconsciously tracing the scar that ran along her right arm, hidden beneath her sleeve. Something flickered in his eyes, not pity, but understanding. "Neither do I, if truth be told. 2 left feet, according to my sister. But the apple pie at these gatherings is worth the trip." Despite herself, Ruby felt the corners of her mouth lift slightly. "Is that so?" "Best in the territory," he confirmed solemnly, though his eyes held a hint of humor. "And I believe every newcomer to Willow Creek should experience it at least once." Ruby studied him for a moment, trying to discern his intentions. In Boston, men had sought her company for her family's former status or her once pretty face. But there was something different about Kieran James, a straightforwardness that was both refreshing and terrifying. "Very well," she said finally. "For the pie." His smile was like sunrise over the mountains. "I'll call for you at 6 then." After he left, Ruby stared at the door for a long time, wondering what had possessed her to accept. She had come west to escape, not to form new attachments. Attachments led to expectations, and expectations inevitably led to disappointment. She had learned that lesson all too well. When Esther returned, Ruby told her about the invitation. Her aunt's eyes lit up with pleasure. "Kieran James is a good man," she said, hanging up her shawl. "Came here after the war just like so many others. Lost his brother at Gettysburg, I believe." Ruby absorbed this information silently, adding it to the little she knew about the marshal. "He seems decent," she admitted reluctantly. Esther smiled knowingly but said nothing more on the subject. Instead, she suggested they close the shop early the next day to find Ruby something suitable to wear. Saturday evening arrived with alarming speed. Ruby stood before the small mirror in her room, hardly recognizing the woman who stared back. Esther had altered a deep blue gown that complemented her auburn hair and made her green eyes seem brighter than they had been in months. She had even managed to style Ruby's hair in a simple but elegant arrangement. The knock at the downstairs door made her start. Taking a deep breath, Ruby descended the stairs, conscious of her aunt's encouraging smile as she opened the door. Kieran James stood on the threshold, looking markedly different from his usual appearance. He had traded his marshal's clothes for a well-tailored dark suit that emphasized his broad shoulders. His dark hair was neatly combed, and he had clearly taken a razor to his usual stubble. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Kieran cleared his throat. "Miss Blackburn, you look lovely." Ruby felt a blush warm her cheeks. "Thank you, Marshal. You clean up rather well yourself." He offered his arm, and after a brief hesitation, Ruby placed her hand upon it. The solid warmth of him was reassuring as they stepped out into the evening air. The church was only a short walk away, its windows glowing with lamplight. The sound of a fiddle and piano drifted out, along with laughter and conversation. Ruby faltered slightly at the entrance, suddenly overwhelmed by memories of another social gathering, one that had ended in tragedy. Kieran must have felt her tension, for he paused. "We don't have to stay long," he said quietly. "Just long enough for pie." Ruby managed a small smile at that. "I believe you promised me the best in the territory. I intend to hold you to that claim." Inside, the church had been transformed. Benches had been pushed aside to create space for dancing, and tables laden with food lined one wall. Lanterns cast a warm glow over everything, and wildflowers decorated every available surface. Ruby felt eyes turn toward them as they entered, and she stiffened under the scrutiny. Kieran, seemingly oblivious, guided her toward a group of people near the refreshment table. "Everyone, this is Miss Ruby Blackburn, Miss Esther's niece," he said, his deep voice carrying easily over the music. "Ruby, these good folks are the heart of Willow Creek." What followed was a flurry of introductions: the doctor and his wife, the schoolteacher, the banker and his family, the blacksmith and his Swedish bride. Names and faces blurred together, but Ruby was struck by the genuine warmth in their welcomes. "We're so pleased you've come to join our little community," said the doctor's wife, a plump, cheerful woman named Margaret. "Your aunt has been a godsend to us all. Not a woman in town who doesn't owe her something beautiful, especially when we've eaten too many of Beatrice's pies and need our dresses let out," added the schoolteacher with a laugh, gesturing toward a younger woman carrying a tray of pie slices. Kieran's eyes lit up. "And speaking of which," he said, guiding Ruby toward the dessert table, "Miss Beatrice, 2 slices of your finest, if you please." The pie was indeed remarkable: sweet tart apples infused with cinnamon and nutmeg, encased in a buttery crust that melted on the tongue. Ruby found herself closing her eyes in appreciation. "Verdict?" Kieran asked, watching her with evident pleasure. "I concede the point," Ruby admitted. "Best apple pie I've encountered, though my mother would have contested the claim." It was the first time she had mentioned her mother since arriving in Willow Creek, and the words slipped out before she could catch them. Kieran noted the slip but didn't press. "Was she a baker?" he asked simply. Ruby nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to speak. "She made every special occasion sweeter." The past tense hung between them, and Kieran's eyes softened with understanding. "I'm sure she would have given Miss Beatrice a run for her money." The music changed then, shifting to a livelier tune that drew couples to the center of the room. Ruby watched as the doctor swept his wife into the dance, followed by several other pairs. "I meant what I said," Kieran told her, "about not dancing. We can just watch if you prefer." Ruby found herself studying his profile in the lamplight. There was something solid about Kieran James, something trustworthy that she had not experienced in a long time. Perhaps it was that quality that made her say, "One dance wouldn't be terrible." His eyebrows rose in surprise, but he wasted no time in setting aside their empty plates and offering his hand. "I should warn you about those left feet." Ruby placed her hand in his, feeling calluses against her palm. "I'll risk it." For all his protests, Kieran proved to be a capable dancer. His movements were not graceful, perhaps, but they were sure and steady. Ruby found herself relaxing into the rhythm, letting the music carry her beyond the walls of her carefully constructed reserve. "You've done this before," she accused lightly as he guided her through a turn. A hint of mischief glinted in his eyes. "A man's got to maintain some mysteries, Miss Blackburn." The dance ended too soon, and Ruby reluctantly stepped back, suddenly aware of how close they had been. Kieran's hand lingered on hers for a moment before he released it. "Thank you," he said quietly. "It's been a long time since I've enjoyed a dance." Ruby nodded, understanding exactly what he meant. "For me as well." They stayed for another hour, during which Ruby found herself drawn into conversation with several of the women. They were curious about her life in Boston but respected her reticence. Instead, they shared stories of their own journeys west, tales of hardship and resilience that resonated deeply with Ruby. By the time Kieran escorted her home, stars were scattered across the vast Montana sky like diamonds on black velvet. The night air held a hint of autumn crispness, and Ruby found herself drawing her shawl closer. "Cold?" Kieran asked, immediately shrugging out of his jacket. "No," Ruby began to protest, but he had already draped it over her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body and carried the faint scent of soap and leather. "Thank you," she said instead. They walked in comfortable silence, their footsteps echoing on the boardwalk. When they reached Esther's shop, Ruby reluctantly removed his jacket and handed it back. "I had a pleasant evening," she said formally, falling back on the social graces ingrained since childhood. Kieran accepted his jacket with a slight bow. "As did I, Miss Blackburn." There was a moment of awkwardness. Then he added, "I patrol past the shop most evenings around sunset. Sometimes I stop at the cafe for coffee first." Ruby recognized the indirect invitation for what it was. "I often take a short walk at that hour. The air helps clear my mind after a day of close work." His smile was worth the admission. "Perhaps our paths will cross then." "Perhaps they will," Ruby agreed softly. After he left, Ruby climbed the stairs to her room, her mind replaying the events of the evening. For the first time in over a year, she had spent hours without the weight of grief and shame pressing down upon her. It was disconcerting and terrifying in its own way. She undressed slowly, careful not to look at the scars that marked her body, evidence of the fire that had claimed her parents and their Boston home while she was trapped inside. The fire that she had survived only because a passing patrolman had heard her screams and braved the flames to pull her free. Physical scars were only the visible reminders. The invisible ones ran deeper: guilt at being the survivor, shame at the circumstances that had led to the fire, fear that she would never be whole again. Ruby slipped her nightgown over her head and extinguished the lamp. In the darkness, she allowed herself to remember Kieran's hand in hers, steady and warm. It had been the first time since the fire that anyone had touched her without making her flinch. True to his word, Kieran James could be seen passing by the dressmaker's shop most evenings, his tall figure easily recognizable even from a distance. And true to her own implied promise, Ruby often found reason to step outside just as he approached. Their conversations began as brief exchanges, comments about the weather, observations about town happenings. But as summer gave way to autumn, these conversations lengthened. Sometimes they would walk to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to open country and the mountains stood like sentinels against the sky. During these walks, Ruby learned more about the man behind the marshal's badge. Kieran had grown up in Pennsylvania, the son of a blacksmith. He had fought for the Union alongside his older brother, who had fallen at Gettysburg. After the war, finding home too full of ghosts, he had drifted west, working as a scout, a ranch hand, and eventually a deputy before becoming marshal of Willow Creek 3 years earlier. "And you?" he asked one evening as they stood watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. "What brought you west, Ruby?" It was the first time he had used her given name, and the sound of it in his deep voice made her breath catch. For a moment, Ruby considered deflecting the question as she had so many times before. But something about the fading light and the vast openness before them made dishonesty seem impossible. "I came because there was nothing left for me in Boston," she said quietly. "My parents died in a fire. Our home, everything we had, gone in a single night." Kieran remained silent, his gaze on the distant peaks, giving her space to continue or stop as she chose. "I was there," Ruby added, her voice barely audible. "I should have died with them." At this, Kieran turned to her, his expression grave. But you didn't. No, Ruby acknowledged, her hand unconsciously moving to her arm where the worst of her scars lay hidden. I didn't. Kieran's gaze followed the movement, and understanding dawned in his eyes. You were injured. It wasn't a question, but Ruby nodded anyway. The doctors said I was lucky, that I would heal. A bitter laugh escaped her. They were only partly right. The silence that followed was heavy with unspoken words. Finally, Kieran said, Some wounds don't show on the outside. And some do, Ruby replied, finally meeting his gaze. Both kinds change you forever. Kieran nodded slowly. I know something about that. Something in his tone made Ruby realize he was speaking from experience. Before she could ask, he pulled back his left sleeve to reveal a jagged scar that ran from wrist to elbow. Shiloh, he said simply. Confederate soldier with a bayonet. I can still feel it sometimes, especially when the weather changes. Ruby stared at the scar, then tentatively reached out to touch it. Kieran remained perfectly still as her fingers traced the ridged flesh. Does it bother you? She asked softly. That people can see it? Kieran considered the question. It did at first. Now it's just part of my story. Ruby withdrew her hand. Mine are worse. They're part of your story too, Kieran said gently. Not the whole of it, but a part. They stood in silence as the last light faded from the sky and stars began to appear. Finally, Ruby spoke again. It wasn't just an accident, she admitted, the words feeling like stones pulled from deep within her. The fire. There were men my father had crossed in business. They came to collect a debt, but he couldn't pay. They said they would teach him a lesson. Kieran's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, allowing her to continue. I was upstairs when I heard the shouting. By the time I came down, the front of the house was already in flames. They had doused it in kerosene and set it alight with my parents still inside the parlor. Ruby's voice shook. I tried to reach them, but the fire spread so quickly. I became trapped in the back of the house. A patrolman pulled me out through a window, but my parents. Ruby, Kieran said softly, and the pain in his voice nearly undid her. The men who did it were never caught, she continued, needing to get it all out now that she had begun. And I was left with nothing but scars and nightmares. That's why I came west. To escape the pity, the whispers, the memories that haunted every street in Boston. Kieran stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cooling evening air. Did it work? The escape? Ruby looked up at him, at the face that had become so dear to her over these autumn weeks. I'm not sure, she admitted, but I think I may have found something here that I wasn't looking for. The moment hung between them, fragile and precious. Then Kieran slowly raised his hand to her face, giving her every chance to pull away. When she didn't, he gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against her cheek. Ruby Blackburn, he said, his voice rough with emotion. You are the bravest person I have ever known. Tears stung her eyes at words she had never expected to hear. I don't feel brave, she whispered. Most days I feel broken beyond repair. Kieran's hand moved to cradle her face. Then we have that in common too. The first snowfall of winter came early that year, blanketing Willow Creek in pristine white. Ruby stood at the window of the shop, watching as children raced through the fresh powder, their laughter carrying clearly through the glass. Behind her, Esther was putting the finishing touches on a wedding dress for the banker's daughter. Beautiful, isn't it? Esther remarked, joining Ruby at the window. First snow always feels like a fresh start. Ruby nodded, her thoughts drifting to Kieran. Their evening walks had continued despite the colder weather, though now they often ended with hot chocolate at the cafe instead of sunset watching. They had not spoken again of that night when Ruby had shared her darkest secrets, but something had shifted between them, a deepening of trust, an acknowledgement of shared pain. "You care for him," Esther observed, interrupting Ruby's thoughts. Ruby didn't pretend to misunderstand. "Is it that obvious?" Her aunt smiled gently. "Only to someone who knows what to look for. The way your eyes follow him when he passes. The way you light up when he enters a room." Heat rose in Ruby's cheeks. "I never meant for it to happen. The heart doesn't always consult with the head before making its choices," Esther said, her own eyes taking on a faraway look. "My Henry proposed 3 weeks after we met. Everyone said we were rushing, but when you know, you know." Ruby turned back to the window, watching as the marshal appeared across the street, helping an elderly man navigate the slippery boardwalk. "It's not so simple, Aunt Esther. Kieran deserves someone whole, not someone carrying so much damage." Esther's voice sharpened. "Nonsense. Every one of us carries damage, Ruby. Some just hide it better than others." She laid a hand on Ruby's arm where the scars lay beneath her sleeve. "These don't make you less deserving of love. They make you a survivor." Before Ruby could respond, the shop door opened, bringing in a flurry of snowflakes and a blast of cold air. Kieran stood in the doorway, dusting snow from his hat. "Ladies," he greeted them, nodding respectfully to Esther before his gaze settled on Ruby with unmistakable warmth. "I hope I'm not interrupting." "Not at all, Marshal," Esther replied. "In fact, I was just telling Ruby that I need someone to deliver this wedding dress to the Thornton house before the next snowfall hits. But with my arthritis acting up in this cold." Ruby shot her aunt a suspicious look. The older woman's arthritis had never prevented her from making deliveries before. "I'd be happy to escort Ruby," Kieran offered immediately. "The Thornton place is out past the creek, and the path can be treacherous in the snow." Esther beamed. "How fortunate we are to have such a dedicated lawman." "Ruby, why don't you wrap up the dress while I find the box?" Within minutes, Ruby found herself walking alongside Kieran, the carefully packaged wedding dress cradled in her arms. The snow had stopped for now, but the sky remained heavy with the promise of more to come. "Your aunt is about as subtle as a stampede," Kieran remarked after they had gone a few blocks, amusement coloring his tone. Ruby couldn't help but laugh. "You noticed that, did you?" "Hard to miss," he replied with a smile. "But I can't say I'm displeased with the result." They walked in comfortable silence for a time, their breath forming clouds in the cold air. The Thornton house was on the outskirts of town, a good 20-minute walk in favorable conditions. With the snow, it would take longer. "I've been thinking," Kieran said suddenly as they crossed the small wooden bridge over Willow Creek, "about what you told me about Boston." Ruby tensed slightly but nodded for him to continue. "The men who did that to your family, would you recognize them if you saw them again?" The question caught her off guard. I think so. Why do you ask?" Kieran's expression turned grim. "Because a telegram came in yesterday from the U.S. Marshal's office in Denver. They've been tracking a gang of men wanted for arson, extortion, and murder across several states. 3 of them were arrested in Colorado last week." Ruby stopped walking, her heart suddenly pounding. "And you think?" "I think it's possible they're the same men," Kieran said gently. "The timing fits, and their method of operation matches what you described." The world seemed to tilt slightly, and Ruby was grateful for Kieran's steadying hand on her arm. "What happens now?" "They're asking for witnesses to come forward," Kieran explained. "If you're willing, I can wire Denver. Let them know you might be able to identify them." Ruby stared at the snow-covered path, memories flooding back with painful clarity. "I never thought I'd have the chance to see justice done." "You don't have to decide now," Kieran assured her. "And you don't have to do it alone. If you choose to go to Denver, I'll go with you. The offer hung in the air between them, weighted with all it implied: his commitment to her, his willingness to stand beside her as she faced her darkest fears. Ruby looked up into his eyes and saw nothing but steadfast support. "I'll think about it," she promised. They resumed walking, the conversation shifting to lighter topics as they approached the Thornton house. The delivery was made without incident, and they started back toward town just as fresh snow began to fall. "We should hurry," Kieran suggested, eyeing the darkening sky. "This looks to be settling in for the duration." They quickened their pace, but the snowfall intensified rapidly, reducing visibility and making the path increasingly difficult to navigate. By the time they reached the creek again, the bridge was barely visible through the curtain of white. "Careful here," Kieran warned, taking Ruby's hand as they stepped onto the snow-covered planks. "It'll be slippery." His caution proved prescient. Halfway across, Ruby's foot slid on a patch of ice hidden beneath the snow. She gasped as she lost her balance, instinctively grabbing for Kieran as she fell. The momentum carried them both sideways, and with a crack of splintering wood, the railing gave way. They tumbled down the embankment and onto the partially frozen creek below. The ice, too thin to support their combined weight, shattered on impact. Ruby felt the shocking cold of the water envelop her, stealing her breath and numbing her limbs almost instantly. She flailed, panic overtaking her as the current pulled at her sodden clothing. Then strong arms were around her, hauling her up and out onto the snowy bank. Kieran's face appeared above her, water streaming from his hair and fear evident in his eyes. "Ruby, are you all right?" Her teeth were chattering too violently for speech, but she managed a nod. Kieran pulled her to her feet, supporting most of her weight. "We need to get you warm," he said urgently. "The old Wilson cabin isn't far. Can you walk?" Ruby tried to take a step, but her waterlogged skirts hampered her movement, and her legs felt like lead. Without hesitation, Kieran swept her up into his arms and began trudging through the snow. Kieran," she managed to stammer. "Why you're wet too?" "I've been colder," he replied grimly, his jaw set with determination. "Just hold on." The cabin appeared like a mirage through the swirling snow, a small, abandoned homestead that had once belonged to a trapper named Wilson. It was little more than a one-room structure with a stone fireplace, but it offered shelter from the storm. Kieran kicked the door open and carried Ruby inside, setting her gently on a rough wooden bench near the fireplace. He immediately set about building a fire, his movements efficient despite his shivering. "We need to get out of these wet clothes," he said once the kindling had caught. "There might be something here we can use." A brief search of the cabin yielded a few moth-eaten blankets and a miner's shirt that had been left behind by a previous occupant. Kieran handed the shirt and a blanket to Ruby. "It's not much, but it's dry. I'll step outside while you change." "Don't be ridiculous," Ruby said through chattering teeth. "You'll freeze. Turn around." Kieran hesitated, then nodded and turned to face the wall. Ruby's numb fingers struggled with the buttons of her dress, and she bit back a sob of frustration. "I can't," she admitted after several failed attempts. "My hands." There was a moment of silence, then Kieran said quietly, "Let me help you." Ruby closed her eyes, torn between necessity and modesty. "All right," she whispered finally. Kieran turned and approached her slowly, his expression grave. "Just the buttons," he promised. "Then I'll turn away again." His fingers, surprisingly steady despite his own shivering, made quick work of the fastenings. Then, true to his word, he turned away once more. Ruby struggled out of the sodden dress and her petticoats, leaving on only her thin chemise, which was damp but not soaked through. She pulled the miner's shirt over it and wrapped the blanket around her shoulders. "You can turn around now," she said, her voice stronger as warmth from the fire began to penetrate her chilled skin. Kieran had removed his own wet shirt and hung it by the fire, leaving him bare-chested. Ruby tried not to stare at the map of scars that crisscrossed his torso, evidence of the war and the hard years that had followed. He quickly wrapped a blanket around his shoulders, but not before Ruby had noticed a particularly vicious scar that ran across his ribs. "Shrapnel," he explained, seeing her gaze. "Petersburg, near the end of the war." Ruby nodded, understanding in that moment just how much they shared, not just pain, but survival against impossible odds. The storm outside intensified, howling around the small cabin and driving snow through every crack and gap in the walls. Inside, the fire crackled, casting dancing shadows across the rough-hewn logs. "We'll have to stay until it passes," Kieran said, settling beside her on the bench. "Could be morning before it's safe to travel." Ruby nodded, acutely aware of his proximity, of the way the firelight played across his features. "Thank you," she said softly, "for pulling me out of the creek, for bringing me here." Kieran's eyes, when they met hers, were intense with emotion. "I wasn't about to let you freeze, Ruby Blackburn." "Even so," she insisted, "you saved my life." Again. His brow furrowed. "Again." "In a different way," Ruby explained. "Before you came along, I was just existing, going through the motions of living without really feeling alive." Kieran was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I know something about that too," he admitted. "After the war, after losing my brother, I drifted for years, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots, never letting myself care too much about anything or anyone." "What changed?" Ruby asked. His eyes returned to hers. "I found this town, these people, purpose, and then—" He hesitated, then continued softly, "And then I found you." The words hung in the air between them, weighted with significance. Ruby felt her heart thundering in her chest, louder than the storm outside. "Kieran," she began, unsure of what she wanted to say. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and brushed a strand of damp hair from her face. "I know you carry scars, Ruby, so do I. But when I'm with you, they don't seem to matter as much." Ruby's throat tightened with emotion. "I'm broken," she whispered, voicing the fear that had haunted her since the fire. "The woman I was before. She died in those flames." Kieran's hand moved to cradle her cheek, his touch infinitely gentle. "Then we'll be broken together till it feels whole." The simplicity of his declaration, the quiet certainty in his voice, broke something loose inside Ruby, a dam that had held back her emotions for so long. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and Kieran gathered her into his arms, holding her as she wept for all she had lost, and all she had feared she would never find again. When the storm of emotion finally passed, Ruby remained in the circle of his arms, her head resting against his chest where she could hear the steady beat of his heart. "I've never told anyone else," she admitted, "about the fire, about how I survived while they didn't." Kieran's arms tightened around her. "Surviving isn't something to be ashamed of, Ruby. It takes courage to keep going when everything in you wants to give up." She lifted her head to look at him. "Is that what you did? After the war?" He nodded slowly. "Each day was a battle in its own way. Waking up, putting one foot in front of the other when the memories threatened to pull me under. But eventually it got easier." "Does it ever stop hurting?" Ruby asked, voicing the question that had haunted her since the night of the fire. Kieran considered this. "Not entirely," he said honestly. "But it changes, becomes something you can carry without being crushed by it." Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small cabin, a different kind of transformation was taking place. As they talked through the night, sharing stories of their past and tentative hopes for the future. Ruby felt something shifting within her, not a sudden healing, but a gradual realignment, like broken bones being carefully set so they could mend properly. Dawn broke clear and cold, the storm having spent its fury overnight. Ruby woke to find herself still in Kieran's arms, both of them wrapped in blankets before the dying embers of the fire. For a moment, she remained still, savoring the peace that had settled over her during the night. Kieran stirred, his eyes opening to meet hers. "Morning," he said softly. "Morning," she replied, struck by the intimacy of the moment, by how right it felt to wake beside him. They dressed in their now dry clothing and prepared to head back to town, where Ruby knew her aunt would be frantic with worry. But before they stepped out into the brilliant white landscape, Kieran caught her hand. "Ruby," he said, his expression serious, "I meant what I said last night, about us being broken together." She looked up at him, this man who had shown her that strength could be found in vulnerability, that scars were not something to hide but badges of survival. "I know you did," she said softly, "and I'm beginning to believe it might be possible." He smiled then, a smile that reached his eyes and warmed her more thoroughly than any fire. "That's enough for now." They walked back to town hand in hand, their footprints marking a shared path through the pristine snow. The decision to travel to Denver was not made lightly. For days after their return from the Wilson cabin, Ruby wrestled with the prospect of facing the men who had destroyed her family and nearly taken her life. Kieran gave her space to consider, never pressing for an answer. It was a week later, as they sat in the cafe sharing apple pie and coffee, that Ruby reached her decision. "I'll go," she said suddenly, interrupting Kieran's story about a dispute between two ranchers. "To Denver. I need to see them, to know for certain if they're the ones." Kieran's expression showed both concern and pride. "I'll arrange for the train tickets. The trial is set to begin in 3 weeks." Ruby nodded, trying to quell the anxiety that rose within her at the thought of the journey, not just the physical distance, but the emotional one she would have to travel to face her past. "You won't be alone," Kieran promised, as if reading her thoughts. "Not for a single moment." The train journey to Denver took 2 days, during which Ruby alternated between nervous anticipation and moments of stark terror. Kieran remained steadfast beside her, his quiet presence a reminder that whatever lay ahead, she would not face it alone. Denver was larger and more imposing than Ruby had imagined, a growing metropolis that bore little resemblance to the frontier towns she had passed through on her journey west. The federal courthouse stood in the heart of the city, a grand stone building that seemed designed to intimidate. The U.S. Marshal who met them at their hotel the night before the trial was a grizzled veteran named Harkins. He listened intently as Ruby recounted her experience, nodding occasionally and taking notes. "3 men in custody match the description you've given," he told her when she had finished. "Tomorrow you'll be asked to identify them in the courtroom. Just tell the truth as you remember it. That's all anyone can ask." That night, Ruby barely slept, her mind filled with images of flames and shadowy figures. Kieran had taken a room adjoining hers, and several times she was tempted to knock on the connecting door, just to hear his reassuring voice. But she resisted, knowing that this was something she needed to face on her own terms. The courtroom the next morning was crowded and uncomfortably warm. Ruby sat beside Kieran in a row of benches reserved for witnesses, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to hide their trembling. When the prisoners were led in, she felt her breath catch in her throat. They were older than she remembered, more worn, but unmistakably the same men who had stood in her family's parlor that night, demanding payment and threatening consequences. One had a distinctive scar that ran from eye to chin. Another walked with a pronounced limp. The third had a shock of white hair that stood out against his weathered face. "That's them," she whispered to Kieran. All three of them. He squeezed her hand supportively as the proceedings began. When Ruby was called to testify, she walked to the witness stand on legs that felt like water. But once she began to speak, describing the events of that terrible night, a strange calm settled over her. The facts were clear in her mind, the memory sharp despite the passage of time. The defense attorney tried to shake her testimony, suggesting that in the chaos and darkness, she couldn't possibly have seen the men clearly enough to identify them. Ruby met his skepticism with quiet certainty. "I saw their faces by the light of the flames they set," she said, her voice steady. "I will never forget them as long as I live." When it was over, when she had answered all the questions and identified all three men without hesitation, Ruby stepped down from the witness stand feeling both exhausted and oddly lightened. Kieran was waiting for her, his face showing nothing but admiration. "You were magnificent," he told her as they left the courthouse. "Absolutely magnificent." Ruby couldn't quite smile, not yet, but she felt a shifting inside as if a burden she had carried for so long had begun to ease. "It's not over," she reminded him. "The trial will go on for days." "But your part is done," Kieran said gently. "You've faced them. You've spoken your truth. Whatever the jury decides, you've done all that could be asked of you." They remained in Denver for another week, until the verdict was delivered. All three men were found guilty of arson and murder, not just for the deaths of Ruby's parents, but for similar crimes across 4 states. The sentence was life imprisonment. As they boarded the train back to Montana, Ruby felt a curious mixture of emotions: relief, grief, a tentative sense of closure. She had expected to feel triumph, but instead found only a quiet certainty that justice, however delayed, had finally been served. "Are you all right?" Kieran asked as the train pulled away from the station, the city slowly receding behind them. Ruby considered the question carefully. "I think I will be," she said finally. "Not today, perhaps not tomorrow, but eventually." Kieran nodded, understanding as always. That's how healing works, day by day, until one morning you wake up and realize the pain isn't the first thing you feel anymore. Ruby looked out at the landscape rushing past, the vastness of it somehow comforting. "I never thought I'd find that morning," she admitted. "After the fire, I was so sure that broken was all I would ever be." Kieran's hand found hers, strong and steady. "Broken doesn't mean beyond repair. It just means you're in the process of becoming something new." Ruby turned her hand to intertwine her fingers with his. "Something stronger, perhaps." "Definitely stronger," he agreed with a smile that warmed her to her core. "And definitely not alone." Spring came early to Willow Creek that year, the snow melting to reveal tender green shoots pushing through the softening earth. Ruby stood outside her aunt's shop, watching as the town emerged from winter's grip with renewed energy. The bell over the door jingled, and Esther joined her on the boardwalk. "Beautiful day," she remarked, squinting up at the clear blue sky. "Makes me think it might be time for some changes." Ruby glanced at her aunt curiously. "What sort of changes?" Esther smiled mysteriously. "I've been thinking it might be nice to have more time for myself. Perhaps travel a bit. Visit my sister in St. Louis." "But what about the shop?" Ruby asked, surprised by this sudden revelation. "Well," Esther said slowly, "I thought perhaps you might like to take it over. You've learned the trade remarkably well, and the ladies of Willow Creek have nothing but praise for your work." Ruby stared at her aunt in astonishment. "You would trust me with your business?" Esther patted her hand affectionately. "My dear, I would trust you with far more than that. You have rebuilt yourself in the time you've been here. I think you're more than capable of running a dress shop." Before Ruby could respond, she spotted Kieran walking toward them, his stride purposeful and his expression determined. He had been unusually reserved since their return from Denver, and Ruby had worried that something had changed between them. "Ladies," he greeted them, removing his hat. "Miss Esther, might I have a word with your niece?" Esther's eyes twinkled knowingly. "Of course, Marshal. In fact, I just remembered an urgent matter that requires my attention inside." With a barely concealed smile, she disappeared back into the shop. Kieran cleared his throat, suddenly appearing nervous, a state Ruby had rarely seen him in. "I wonder if you might accompany me for a walk?" Intrigued by his unusual demeanor, Ruby agreed. They strolled through town toward the creek where they had fallen that snowy day. The wooden bridge had been repaired, and new railings installed stronger than before. Kieran stopped at the center of the bridge, looking down at the water flowing freely below, no longer constrained by ice. "I've been doing a lot of thinking since we returned from Denver," he began. Ruby's heart quickened. "Oh!" He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "Watching you in that courtroom, seeing your courage as you faced down the men who hurt you, it reminded me of why I fell in love with you." The words hung in the air between them, and Ruby felt her breath catch. They had never spoken so directly of love, though it had been implied in 1,000 small ways over the months. "Kieran," she began, but he gently pressed a finger to her lips. "Let me finish or I might lose my nerve," he said with a self-deprecating smile. "Ruby Blackburn, when you came to Willow Creek, I thought I knew who I was and what my life would be. I was content enough doing my job serving this town. But then I met you, and everything changed." He took her hands in his touch warm and familiar. "You showed me that being broken isn't the end of the story. It's just the middle chapter in a much longer tale." Ruby felt tears welling in her eyes, but they were different from any she had shed before, tears not of grief or pain, but of a joy so intense it bordered on disbelief. "I love you," Kieran continued, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Every part of you, scarred and whole alike. And if you'll have me, I want to spend the rest of my days helping you discover just how strong and beautiful you truly are." With that, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small, simple ring. "Ruby Blackburn, will you marry me?" For a moment, Ruby could only stare at the ring, a delicate silver band set with a small but perfect sapphire that caught the spring sunlight. Then she looked up into Kieran's face, at the love and hope shining in his eyes, and knew with absolute certainty that her answer could only be one thing. "Yes," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "Yes, I will marry you, Kieran James." His smile was radiant as he slipped the ring onto her finger. Then he gathered her into his arms and kissed her with a tenderness that made her heart overflow. When they finally parted, both breathless, Ruby rested her forehead against his. "I'm still broken in places," she whispered, wanting him to be certain. Kieran brushed a gentle kiss across her brow. "And I still have scars that ache when storms are coming. But together, Ruby, together we're something new, something stronger than either of us could be alone." They were married that summer in the small church where they had first danced. The entire town turned out for the occasion, the church overflowing with wildflowers and well wishes. Esther, resplendent in a new gown of her own design, wept openly as she watched her niece speak her vows. Ruby wore a dress she had created herself, with sleeves that neither hid nor emphasized the scars on her arms. They were simply there, part of her story, neither defining her nor diminishing her. And when Kieran looked at her as she walked toward him, she saw in his eyes not the broken woman who had arrived in Willow Creek, but the whole person she had become, strong, resilient, capable of both giving and receiving love. "I, Ruby, take you, Kieran," she said, her voice clear and steady. "To be my husband, to share in life's joys and sorrows, to stand beside you in strength and in weakness, until death parts us." Kieran's voice was husky with emotion as he repeated his own vows. Then, as the minister pronounced them husband and wife, he gathered her into his arms and kissed her with a promise of all the days to come. The years that followed brought changes to Willow Creek. The railroad came through, bringing new settlers and new opportunities. Ruby's dress shop flourished, expanding to include fabrics and notions imported from as far away as Europe. Kieran continued as marshal, his fair-minded approach to justice earning him respect throughout the territory. 3 years after their wedding, their family grew with the birth of twins, a boy with Kieran's dark hair and Ruby's green eyes, and a girl whose auburn curls and determined expression were a mirror of her mother's. They named them Daniel, after Kieran's fallen brother, and Elizabeth, after Ruby's mother. On the twins' 5th birthday, as they celebrated with a picnic by the creek that had played such a pivotal role in their parents' story, Daniel asked about the scars on his mother's arms. "Where did those come from, Mama?" he asked, his young face curious but without judgment. Ruby exchanged a glance with Kieran, who nodded encouragingly. "They're from a fire long ago," she explained gently. "Before I came to Willow Creek, before I met your father." "Did it hurt?" Elizabeth wanted to know, her small hand reaching out to touch the ridged flesh. "Yes," Ruby answered honestly. "Very much. But the pain doesn't last forever. Papa has scars too," Daniel observed, pointing to Kieran's forearm where the bayonet wound was visible below his rolled-up sleeve. Kieran nodded solemnly. "I do. Everyone has scars, children. Some you can see, like Mama's and mine. Some you can't because they're on the inside. But they all tell the story of where we've been and what we've survived." Elizabeth considered this with the serious expression that made her look so much like Ruby. "Are you and Mama still broken?" she asked finally. Ruby looked at Kieran, at the man who had taught her that broken didn't mean beyond repair, that healing was possible even when it seemed impossible. Then she looked at their children, these miraculous beings who represented all that could grow from brokenness when it was tended with love. "No, sweetheart," she said softly. "We're not broken anymore. We're whole, just in a different way than before." Later that night, as they lay together in the quiet darkness of their bedroom, Ruby traced the familiar lines of Kieran's face with gentle fingers. "Did you mean what you said today?" she asked. "About not being broken anymore?" Kieran caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I did. The scars remain, but they've become part of something new, something stronger. Like when a bone breaks and heals, the place where it was broken becomes the strongest part." Ruby nestled closer to him, listening to the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "When I first came to Willow Creek, I thought I was beyond repair. I never imagined finding this a home, a family, a love that could make broken pieces whole again." Kieran's arms tightened around her. "That first day, when I saw you standing alone with your valise, looking so lost and yet so determined, I knew you were someone special. I just didn't know you would become my everything." Ruby raised her face to his, her heart full to overflowing. "I love you, Kieran James, for seeing me when I was invisible, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself, for showing me that broken together can become whole." His kiss was tender, a reaffirmation of all they had built together from the ruins of their past. "I love you, Ruby James, yesterday, today, and all our tomorrows." Outside their window, stars scattered across the vast Montana sky, bearing witness to the quiet miracle of healing, not the erasing of scars, but the transformation of them into a map of resilience, a testament to the power of love to make whole what once was broken.